Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
At the reunion, my mom bragged about my cousin's scholarship, her white coat ceremony, and even how she never forgets to moisturize, as if that, too, was somehow an accomplishment to be revered. She didn't say a damn thing about me, not a whisper, not a glance in my direction when they went around the tables clinking wine glasses and gushing about who had done what in the last year. I folded chairs in the sun. I wiped down tables with damp paper towels that smelled like vinegar and sadness. My hair was sticking to the back of my neck, and my palms were raw from hauling folding chairs back to the truck, but I still smiled when Aunt Paula said how proud she was of Maya, how she was just a little genius in a lab coat. I smiled like someone who wasn't choking on every word. You know how some families have that one child who's practically dipped in gold from birth? Who walks in and every face lights up like they're the second coming of Christ, while the rest of us are stuck playing supporting roles in a show we didn't audition for. That's Maya. She could breathe wrong and someone would call it a miracle. Me? I once ran the local library's summer program single-handedly for 6 weeks after budget cuts, and my mom told people I worked with kids or something. That's how invisible I've always been. The reunion was held in Uncle Don's backyard, under those big rented white tents with the scalloped edges and string lights that don't come on until dusk, but make everything look like a wedding once they do. There were plastic tables covered in red and white checkered cloths, tubs full of soda and beer, and way too many mosquitoes. My mom had been fluttering around all day like she was the damn Queen of Tennessee, hugging people, laughing too loud, and finding new ways to weave Maya into every conversation, like she was the thread holding the family together. At one point, during the speeches, yes, actual speeches, she said, "I just can't believe how lucky we are to have Maya in the family. A future doctor, folks. Can you believe it? She's gonna change lives." I stood there holding a tray of deviled eggs I'd helped make that morning because my mom said we couldn't just show up empty-handed, and I waited for her to say anything about me. But my name never made it past her lips. I was the one who arranged the catering drop-off, printed the place cards, and got there early to make sure the damn ice cream machine didn't short-circuit again like last year. But all of that wasn't worth as much as Maya's latest Instagram post in a lab coat. There was this one moment. I remember it too clearly because it was small and stupid, but it stuck. Maya was laughing with a group of ants under the tent, the sun hitting her perfect skin just right, and my mom turned to me and said, "You see how she carries herself? That's what happens when someone knows they're going places." Then she walked away, leaving me standing there with my arms full of folding chairs, like a hired hand who overstayed her welcome. I didn't say anything. I didn't throw the chair or slam it down. I just swallowed whatever that lump in my throat was and kept folding. It's a weird thing, really, how you can be grown, have bills, have a job, hell, even pay for your own dental insurance, and still feel like a useless 12-year-old when your mom looks right through you. I kept smiling, kept making small talk with distant cousins whose names I only remembered from Facebook, and tried not to let the tightness in my chest spill out of my eyes. Later, when the party started to die down and people migrated to the fire pit with their plastic cups of whiskey and stories they'd told 1,000 times, I stayed behind to clean up. I wasn't even asked. It's just what I do. That's my role. The helper. The doer. The one who makes sure everything runs smooth so everyone else can shine. My mom didn't stay behind. She was off drinking sangria and basking in someone else's accomplishments. That night, after I got home and showered the sweat and resentment off my body, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the glow of my phone screen. I wasn't going to check it. I honestly didn't care if anyone had texted me, but something told me to open it. And there it was, a message from Maya, of all people. It read, "Mom's crying in the garage. What happened?" I stared at it for a long time. Not because I didn't know what she was talking about, but because I knew exactly what it was, and I hadn't even done anything yet. Not really. You ever feel like something inside you cracked so long ago, you forgot it was broken until someone pointed it out? That was me, staring at that message, feeling the slow burn of something finally shifting inside me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. When I first read Maya's message, "Mom's crying in the garage. What happened?" I didn't respond right away, and not because I didn't know what to say, but because in that one brief sentence, so innocent on the surface, so clearly typed in confusion and concern, there was a silent acknowledgement that something had changed. That something about the air at that damn reunion had shifted just slightly enough to make someone finally notice the tension I've been carrying like a second spine for years. I sat in the dark of my bedroom, phone in hand, the blue light turning my face hollow in the reflection of the window, and I read her words over and over again, not because I didn't understand them, but because I wanted to savor the moment. Not her concern, not her worry, but the fact that something I had not said, something I had not done, was still enough to shake the peace my mother had wrapped herself in like a mink coat for decades. I didn't text back that night. I went to bed with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion, the kind that sinks into your bones like wet sand after a storm, and I slept deeper than I had in weeks. The next morning, the sky outside was cloudy and strange, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or just sulk, and the air carried that weight, that heaviness that tells you something is coming, but not just yet. I made coffee, fed my cat, and watched the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the sidewalk while their mother shouted something from the porch, and for a minute, I pretended like everything was normal, like my phone didn't buzz again with another message from Maya. She won't talk. Just keeps saying she's a bad mother. Did someone say something? I stared at the screen, and this time, I did reply, not to clear anything up, not to ease the panic I could sense in Maya's tone, but to push just slightly on the crack that had already formed. I typed, some things don't need to be said out loud to finally be heard, and I left it at that. No emojis, no follow-up, no explanation. And within seconds, I saw the dots appear. Maya was typing, then not typing, then typing again, then nothing. And I knew, without a doubt, that her mind was unraveling a thread that had been loosely tied for years, now finally coming undone in her own hands. The truth is, I didn't plan anything. I didn't go to that reunion thinking I'd sabotage my mother's ego or break open some family wound with a dramatic scene. I went like I always go, because that's what daughters are supposed to do, even when it costs more than it gives back. But what happened, whatever it is Maya was witnessing in that garage, didn't come from something sudden or cruel. It came from accumulation, from years of being overlooked, of being the default setting in a family obsessed with sparkle, of being talked around, never directly to, unless something needed doing. It came from a silence that had grown thick and fertile, the kind that breeds resentment in layers so deep, you forget where it even began. I think what broke her, finally, wasn't that I said anything, because I didn't, but that I stopped pretending. I stopped nodding when she listed Maya's achievements. I stopped smiling when she said, you know, you and Maya are like night and day. I stopped being useful. I sat down for a while. I drank some lemonade and didn't refill the ice bucket when it ran low. I didn't wipe up the spilled coleslaw or chase down napkins blowing across the yard. I didn't offer to fix the playlist when the music stopped. I just existed. Still. Quiet. Watching. And in that stillness, I think she saw it, not anger, not bitterness, but the withdrawal of effort, and for a woman like her, who lives off performance and praise, that silence was deafening. That night, I remembered a moment from my childhood, one I hadn't thought about in years. I was maybe 10, maybe 11. We were at a different family barbecue, back when my parents were still married and I still believed adults knew what they were doing. I had drawn a picture, something silly with crayons, a cartoon of our family with exaggerated features and word bubbles. I was proud of it, glowing even, and I ran to my mom to show her. She took one look, smiled faintly, and said, "That's cute, honey. Why don't you go show Uncle Don? He likes that kind of stuff." Then she turned back to her wine glass and the conversation she was having with Aunt Paula about Maya's piano recital. That drawing ended up in the trash, and I didn't draw again until high school. Maya doesn't know any of that. She doesn't know how many birthdays my mom forgot, how many times I stood in the wings while Maya stood center stage, how many times I said I was fine when I wasn't because I didn't want to be accused of jealousy. But now she knows something's wrong. And that's enough for now. The next day, I went to the grocery store, ran some errands, lived my life like nothing was shifting beneath the surface, but inside, I was acutely aware that the balance had tilted just a little in my favor. I knew my mother wouldn't reach out, not yet, because the kind of shame she was feeling doesn't announce itself. It festers. It stews. It waits until just the right moment to explode, and when it does, it never sounds like guilt. It sounds like blame. I didn't feel sorry. Not even a little. I felt curious. Curious about what Maya would do next. Curious if my mother would find the courage to face the mirror she'd spent decades avoiding. And mostly, I was curious about how much further I'd be willing to go, not to hurt anyone, but to finally be seen. There's a strange kind of liberation in realizing that the person whose approval you've chased your entire life never actually held the authority you imagined they did, that the throne they sat on was one they built themselves out of fragile things, expectations, pride, image, fear, and it takes only a small shift in perspective to watch the entire structure crumble beneath them. After Maya's message and my intentionally cryptic reply, the silence that followed wasn't just a pause between conversations. It was something heavier, more deliberate, like the quiet hum right before a light bulb bursts. For the first time, I didn't feel like I needed to chase the resolution. I let the silence expand. I let her wonder. I let it sit there, breathing on its own. And while my mother apparently unraveled in her garage like a woman discovering her own reflection for the first time, I sat down at my desk that night and pulled out something I hadn't touched in over 10 years, an old, heavy, spiral-bound journal with a cracked spine and faded cover that still smelled faintly like stale coffee and dried tears. It wasn't a diary, not in the way girls were told to keep one, filled with hearts and boys and song lyrics scribbled in glitter pen. No, this was something closer to a record, a long, quiet collection of moments, observations, facts. It was my accounting book, not for money, but for something far more valuable, emotional debt. I had started it when I was 16, during a period when I was convinced I was going crazy, or maybe just invisible, because every time I tried to speak up at home, it was like my words passed through walls no one else could see. So instead of yelling, I wrote. Not poetry. Not therapy. Cold facts. Page after page, I had chronicled what I came to call the tiny stabs, the comments, the glances, the corrections in public, the dismissals at dinner, the loud praise for others that always echoed louder in the silence that followed when my name was absent. I wrote down the date, the time, the event. I recorded conversations word for word when I could remember them, and I always remembered them. A mother doesn't have to hit you or scream at you to do damage. Sometimes all it takes is repeated neglect so expertly disguised as love that even you start to think you're just ungrateful for not feeling grateful enough. There was the time she asked me to help her plan Maya's graduation party, even though I was the one who had just finished my master's degree in library science and no one in the family had even mentioned it in passing. There was the time I got promoted to head librarian and she said, "That's sweet, honey. It must be nice to have so much free time at work," as if my career was a placeholder until something real came along. There was the Christmas she gave Maya a plane ticket to Europe and handed me a candle, still in the clearance wrapper, with the label half peeled off. I wrote it all down, not because I planned to use it, not at first, but because I needed proof that I wasn't imagining it. Gaslighting doesn't always come from malicious strangers. It often wears the face of a woman who brushes your hair and calls it love while slowly turning your face away from the mirror. I didn't go through all of it that night. There were too many entries, too many scrawled lines in the margins, and each one threatened to pull me into a spiral I wasn't ready to fall through just yet. But I flipped through enough to remind myself that what I was feeling wasn't some impulsive reaction to one bad day. This was layered, fossilized, built into the sediment of who I had become, and my mother had helped pour every inch of it. And then, as I sat with that journal in my lap, fingers tracing the indentation of old ink, I began to wonder what had actually happened in that garage. What words had cracked through the walls she built? Had someone said something to her? Had Maya, with her wide, earnest eyes and ever-present need to make everything better, asked a question that finally landed a little too hard, like a brick tossed through stained glass? Or had it just been the quiet? Had it been me, Sitting still for once, smiling too little, looking too calmly into her face without the desperate sparkle of need she was so used to seeing in my eyes. Maybe for her, that was the betrayal. Maybe she felt it as a loss of control. And if I'm being honest, and I promised myself I would be honest in telling this story, it wasn't just about her that night. It wasn't just her tears, her confusion, or her unraveling that shifted the ground beneath us. It was the realization, for me, that I no longer feared her disappointment, that I no longer wanted anything from her, that the illusion of needing to win her affection had finally evaporated, leaving me with clarity sharp enough to cut with. I knew then what I was going to do next. Not something cruel or dramatic, not some explosion of long-held rage, but something quiet and effective, the kind of thing you do when you've waited long enough for a shift in power and finally realize you don't need anyone's permission to take it. I was going to return something to Maya. Not the message. Not a reply. But a truth. Something I had learned the hard way and she hadn't yet touched. I was going to place it gently in her lap and walk away, not as punishment, but as a gift, because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who's been fed a fantasy their whole life is tell them the truth and let them sit with it. That night, as I closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer, I didn't feel righteous, and I certainly didn't feel healed. But I felt something else ready. Not for revenge, not for reconciliation, but for release. For once, I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for freedom. It was 2 days later when Maya asked to meet, her tone polite as always, that same sugar-coated concern she'd inherited from Aunt Paula laced beneath every syllable, but now I could sense the hesitation in it too. The careful pacing of someone who's begun to realize that not everything they've been told is true, and suddenly every memory starts to feel like it might need to be reevaluated, refiled, or outright discarded. She asked if I wanted to grab coffee, just to talk, and although we both knew it wasn't really just about coffee, I agreed with a calmness that surprised even me. I didn't prepare for the conversation, didn't rehearse any lines in the mirror or sketch out a subtle revenge monologue in my head, because I knew this wasn't about what I was going to say, it was about what I wasn't going to say. It was about watching Maya take her first few steps across the same emotional minefield I had been living in since childhood, and seeing how she handled the weight of confusion. When the pedestal she'd been placed on started to crack beneath her. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, one of those places with reclaimed wood tables and exposed brick walls, where the baristas wear beanies in the summer and write people's names on cups with unnecessary loops and hearts. She was already sitting at a window seat when I walked in, her posture too perfect, her fingers nervously circling the lid of her coffee like it was a prayer wheel, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because even though she had always been the golden child, the one drenched in praise and constantly told she could be anything she wanted, I could see in her eyes that the past 48 hours had unsettled her, had peeled back a corner of the warm, soft world she thought she knew, and underneath, there was something cold, something unfamiliar, something not meant for her but somehow reaching for her anyway. She stood to hug me, and I let her, though I didn't return it fully. It wasn't a cruel gesture, just a boundary she wasn't used to feeling from me. We sat. We sipped. We talked, lightly at first, about work and the weather, and how the town had changed since she moved to Boston. She mentioned how hard med school had been lately, how Aunt Paula was pushing her to specialize in dermatology even though she wasn't sure that's what she wanted, and I just nodded, listening without offering the kind of validation she was probably used to receiving. And then, after a pause long enough to be awkward, she said, "So, what's going on with your mom?" Her voice cracked just slightly, like the question itself had taken something out of her. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took another sip of my coffee and looked out the window, as if the answer might be walking down the sidewalk, dressed in a coat of clarity. Finally, I said, slowly and deliberately, "I think she's starting to feel the weight of all the things she's chosen to ignore." Maya blinked. "What do you mean?" she asked, and I could tell she genuinely didn't know. That was the moment I realized just how carefully the narrative had been curated for her over the years, how she had been kept at the center of the family's attention not only by praise, but by omission, by the things she hadn't been told. hadn't been allowed to see. I leaned forward slightly, not menacingly, not even dramatically, just enough to bridge the small physical gap between us, and said, "She's built her whole identity on your success. Every time you achieved something, she wore it like a badge, like proof that she did something right, because God forbid she look at the rest of us and see what she didn't nurture." Maya's lips parted slightly, a defense ready to rise, but no words came out. I continued, gently but firmly, "It's not your fault. You didn't ask for it. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt the rest of us. And now that I've stopped playing along, she doesn't know who she is without that story." That was the first time she didn't maintain eye contact. Her gaze dropped to her hands, which had now stilled on the cup. "She kept saying she was a bad mother," Maya said quietly, and I nodded. "Maybe she is. Or maybe she was just too busy being a good audience member for your life to notice the rest of us were performing too." The silence that followed was thick, not hostile, but heavy, like the first moment after you realize a relationship you thought was built on mutual respect might have been more about convenience and control. I didn't need her to defend me or to apologize for being favored. That wasn't the point. What I needed, what I had always needed, was for someone to see it, to see me, to see the imbalance that had become so normal it no longer registered as strange. And in that moment, watching Maya's jaw tighten as she swallowed something she couldn't quite name, I knew I had done what I came there to do. When we parted ways, she hugged me again, this time tighter, longer, like she was trying to say something through the gesture that she couldn't yet put into words. And I let her. I even patted her back once. Because for all her privilege, for all the unearned admiration she'd been drowning in for years, she was still just another daughter trying to make sense of the chaos she was born into, still just another woman slowly waking up to the truth that love, in families like ours, often comes with asterisks and footnotes no one wants to read. Later that evening, I received another message from her. It simply said, "I think I'm starting to understand." I didn't reply, not because I didn't want to, but because she needed to sit in that silence now, the same way I had for years, and listen to what it had to say. The morning after Maya's message, the one where she'd quietly confessed, "I think I'm starting to understand," the world outside looked eerily normal, as if nothing had shifted, as if the ground hadn't cracked beneath us in the way that changes everything going forward, even if no one else feels it just yet. The sky was a wide gray sheet with soft rolls of fog pressed against the edges, and the air had that strange texture that comes right before autumn fully settles in, when the world starts to cool without warning and the light falls just a little flatter on your skin. I sat at the kitchen table with my usual mug of black coffee and stared at my phone for several minutes before flipping it face down, not because I was expecting anything specific, but because some small part of me was aware that the silence meant movement. That something was building somewhere, and this time, I wasn't the one carrying it. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the sun began to sink behind the roofs and paint the porch with tired gold, that I finally got the call, not from Maya, but from my mother. Her name lit up on the screen, familiar and unwanted, like a song you once loved and now associate only with pain. For a long second, I considered letting it ring through to voicemail, just to reclaim some small, meaningless victory, but I answered, not because I was ready, not because I owed her anything, but because I wanted to hear how her voice would sound now that the performance was over and the spotlight had shifted away. She didn't start with a greeting. She didn't even say my name. She launched straight into it, her voice strained in that clipped, breathless way that tells you someone's been crying but doesn't want you to know they've been crying, as if acknowledging the pain might somehow make them smaller. She asked flatly, "Did I do something to make you hate me?" And even though I had rehearsed 1,000 possible versions of this conversation in my mind over the years, imagine the clever retorts and devastating monologues that would finally make her see what she'd done, all I could say in that moment, with a calm so steady it startled me, was, "No, Mom. You did something to make me disappear." The silence on the other end of the line wasn't empty. It was full of years, full of echoes, full of every moment she'd looked past me, measured me against someone else, pushed me aside, or smiled too brightly at Maya while I stood nearby, holding plates, folding napkins, offering up my usefulness like it was the only currency I had. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, lower, carrying none of the bite or bravado I'd grown up dodging. "You never said anything," she whispered, as if the lack of confrontation somehow proved innocence. I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but from the sheer absurdity of that statement. I replied, slowly, deliberately, "You only hear what validates your version of events. Anything else, you write off as moodiness or drama or ingratitude." She tried to defend herself, of course. Brought up memories where she claimed she was proud of me. When I graduated, when I helped her organize the church fundraiser, when I won that local essay contest back in high school. But every story she clung to was punctuated by the same invisible caveat. They weren't about me. They were about her feeling like a good mother. They were about how she looked standing next to me, smiling for the photo, collecting compliments that weren't truly hers. It wasn't love, it was presentation. And I think, somewhere in her bones, she knew that. I think, beneath her fragile defensiveness and reflexive guilt, there was a deeper awareness that she had built her motherhood around the child who made her look good, while quietly neglecting the one who asked for nothing but presence and was given silence in return. She didn't apologize. Not in the way I would have wanted. There was no dramatic, tearful confession, no sweeping change of heart, no words that would have made up for the ache I've been carrying like a second skin. What she said instead, after a long, trembling pause, was this: "I don't know how to fix what I never saw was broken." And in that moment, I felt something break free inside me, not forgiveness, not closure, but release. We ended the call not with peace, not with warmth, but with something resembling an agreement that there was no going back, no undoing the years, no stitching together a version of us that didn't come with holes. But also that the pretending was over. Later that week, Maya came over, this time unannounced, holding a small brown paper bag with 2 blueberry muffins and that same look in her eyes, cautious, sad, but more alert than I'd ever seen it. We sat on the back porch, watching the trees rustle in that restless way they do when fall is near but hasn't quite committed, and she told me, in halting words, how she had asked her mom about the differences in how we were treated growing up, and how, for the first time, Aunt Paula didn't know how to answer. Maya said she felt like her memories were shifting, like rooms she'd walked through 100 times were suddenly rearranged, unfamiliar. She asked me if I regretted anything, if I thought maybe things could have been different if I'd just said something sooner, and I looked at her, not with anger, not even with resentment, but with the tired clarity of someone who has stopped needing to explain herself. I said, "Some people get the kind of love that fills them up, and some people get the kind that leaves them hungry enough to survive on scraps. And when you've spent your whole life surviving, you don't waste time regretting the meals you never had, you just make damn sure you don't feed your hunger to someone else's child." Maya didn't cry, but her eyes stayed wet for a long time, and when she finally left, she hugged me not like a cousin, not like someone performing familial affection, but like a woman who had finally learned something hard and true. I stood on the porch for a long time after she was gone, the muffins untouched beside me, the air growing colder by the minute. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was emptier than I had expected, but not in a hollow, aching way. More like when you finally clear out a room that's been packed with junk for years, and you suddenly see how much space was always there, waiting to be used. So no, this isn't the part of the story where everything gets better. This isn't where we all sit down at a table and forgive each other over pie. This is the part where I live differently. Where I stop folding chairs without being asked. Where I speak only when I have something to say. Where I leave early or not at all. Where I let go not because it heals me, but because holding on never did. And maybe that's the closest thing to revenge I'll ever need.